Hello, everybody. This is Robert Maynard, and this is the third edition of a series that I've been started called "Exploring the Divine Presence." The last session we did a session that was called "What the Nature of Consciousness," and we ended that session with talking about whether or not includes individual identity or whether or not it's all one. I'll get into that in a minute, but because we're going to review that before going into the meat of this section. This session is going to be entitled The Road to Freedom. It's a takeoff on The Road Less Traveled, this book by Scott Peck, and I'm going to get into that a little bit as we get into why I picked that title. But let's go back and do a quick summary of the last session. The last session we were talking about advances in science. It was pointing to the conclusion that the universe or world, the visible world as we know it, was emerged from consciousness. Many um, disciplines in science are pointing to the possibility that physical reality as we know it was an emergent property of consciousness. And my contention is that we are it is behoove us to pursue this further, because if that is true, that brings us. We ended with that session with the nature of consciousness, because that brings a point through which the human sciences and the physical sciences come together. The physical sciences for a long time talked about a theory of everything, but they were only talking within the physical sciences, and that's primarily because the physical sciences are dominated by a philosophy of materialism. So you got scientific um, face being put on a philosophical premise. So you got the data that we observe when we do experiments, stuff like that, and we do observations. It's interpreted in the framework of a philosophical premise of materialism. So this makes it very hard to really have a worldview that's going to deal. I mean, we have had the worldview of the human sciences were absorbed into this, and the result of this absorbing the human sciences into physical sciences was that, as B.F. Skinner once said, behavioral psychologist, in order to apply the disciplines of the physical sciences to the human behavior, to human beings, you have to assume the human being is not free. And ruled by experts according to scientific principle was the guiding principle of the 20th century. You had Stalin, you had Hitler, you had all these dictatorial organizations that justified their notion in terms of science. But my argument is that it's not really just science per se, but it's a specific premise behind that science is materialism. This materialist philosophy leads to the notion, according to B.F. Skinner, that human beings are not free. Now, if you add, let's review, if you take some of the advances of modern science, quantum physics, the some of the scientific mathematical musings of Kurt Gödel, or the computer science of Roger Penrose, you have a different view that is not so mechanistic, and they're moving away from the idea that maybe mind is not just brain, that the physical reality is an emergent property of the underlying consciousness. And when Heisenberg came up with his uncertainty principle that shook the foundation of physics, and because everything's measurement has got to be certain, according to Einstein. Einstein was famously said, God does not play dice with the universe. But it turns out Heisenberg apparently was right. Now, there is an argument now that the uncertainty principle in the quantum physics, you got before a wave/particle is observed in that it can be described as a probability function. In other words, until it's observed and measured, the position in time is only a probability. And so some have made the argument that actually it doesn't coalesce or into an actual entity until it's observed, because the mathematical formulas that describe its position in momentum and stuff like are probability functions. Now, people are saying that this explains free will, and because it's not determined. Well, the free will is more of a rational. It's not just the lack of determination. It's the actual choice. And so a lot of philosophers saying no, uncertainty principle and the incompleteness theorem doesn't explain free will, it allows for free will. And so the argument, now I'm going to get back, I want to quickly go back into the not the uncertainty principle, Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem. His argument is any mathematical system that is sophisticated enough to be useful, to be computational, is going to have things in it that we know to be true that are, now I went into this before. There's two parts to it, and this is the first part. And this is the part I want to go into. There's another part to it about the consistency. But this has to do with you can find something that is true that is not provable from the axioms or the methodology, formal methodology within the system. So therefore, it's incomplete. And his argument was, well, that doesn't mean math is useless. It's going to have it just means it's going to have a blind spot. And there's, for an analogy, I saw there was a analogy that I was reading in this book called The Modern Faith in Ancient Physics, and he was explaining that this incompleteness theorem, he explained it like, you know, if you had this maze, and within the maze you're trying to find, you start here, you're trying to get here, and in a maze like this, and actually you can't get there, because you'll find out if you look from above down on the maze, you'll notice that the maze is walled off. Now you could keep trying and you're not going to get there, but you can't prove just because you haven't got there that getting there is impossible. So from within your viewpoint, from being in the maze, it is impossible to prove you can't get there. But from a perspective outside the maze, looking at the maze, you can see that it's impossible to get there because it's walled off. But you can only see that if you have a perspective of looking outside. So this is similar to an argument that I've made, is that in mathematical set theory, the reason why the set of mathematics is incomplete is because the system that we use to describe is not closed. So there is transcendence. There is something beyond the physical physical universe, or the universe of cause and effect, phenomenal world of cause and effect. That's why it's incomplete, because it doesn't describe a closed system. Or you can observe something from a transcendent perspective. It's not possible to be observable from within that system itself. So I just wanted to go. Now, we talked a little bit about this last time. And we went into the question as to the nature of consciousness, because this is important. If consciousness is the ultimate reality, in some Eastern philosophy, particularly like Buddhism and Hinduism, make the argument, some interpretations of it, that if the religious quest is to be at one with reality, and reality is one, So if you're at one with reality, then your differentiated existence no longer exists. There is no more you. There's just the one. So I gave a talk one time at there was a TV show, and there was a class on consciousness and society, and they were talking about the nature of consciousness. Is it one? Is it individual or is it collective? If you have collective or communal consciousness, what happens to the individual consciousness? Does it get absorbed? Reminds me of the old Star Trek Next Generation, where they encountered a Borg. You will be assimilated. Your personality is assimilated into the Borg collective. And some people's view of consciousness, if you have a collective, and some of the scientists are starting to say, well, if consciousness is the core principle of reality, then probably that vision is true. Then your consciousness is absorbed into the one, and you have this one. That is questionable in terms of its basis. Now, we're going to talk about its basis, whether or not that viewpoint would give us free will, individual personal dignity, the human being, human choice, human action. If your consciousness as an individual moral agent does not exist, then what happens to your value as an individual? What happens to the philosophical basis for human rights and human dignity and human free will? I don't think it exists, without going into a lot of detail. I also think that it's not necessarily the right conclusion that if you have the one, the ground of consciousness, the union with that consciousness absorbs your individual identity. Now, this is going to touch into religious and philosophical and psychological notions now. We're going to move away from science, because I don't think directly is possible to solve this dilemma through a strictly scientific application. I think this is like the person in the maze. Whether or not you can get there, you can't tell from that perspective. So you need a different perspective. And I've made the argument before that the religious perspective, particularly Judeo-Christian, but I would say religion in general, starts with the experience or the sense of transcendence. St. Paul, and I've talked about this before in previous, defines faith as the evidence of things not seen and the substance of things hoped for. It's an evidence. In other words, it's a sensory. You don't need to prove something. You sense something is there. There's something behind the veil. There's a reality behind the veil of existence as we know it that we sense. And that's faith is not just the blind belief in the dogma. Faith is it's almost like a extrasensory perception. It's also the substance of things hoped for. If there is something beyond this phenomenal existence of cause and effect, then the ability to transcend is fundamental. But if we can reach out to this being, then we can transcend the reality of cause and effect, and human existence all of a sudden brings about the possibility of free will. It is in this act of transcendence where we have free will, and that's why laws of cause and effect are not the dominant explanation of reality. That's the reality as we know it. Is, like I said, what accounts for the incompleteness theorem and Gödel's incompleteness theorem is the reality is we know it's not a closed system. That's why you have Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. You can't measure, you can't be certain about something at a quantum level ahead of time, because the very act of observing it impacts it. So you have impact on things they're not just standalone events. There is realities that are impacting it, and the very act of measuring that thing is going to alter it. Now that's what some scientists have argued, that Einstein's theory of relativity talks about, that space and matter and time are relative to speed, or relative to an observer, would speed being the constant, the speed of light being the constant, is relative to the observer. Einstein's theory of relativity. And some of there's Robert Landon, I think, is a biologist that is, and then there was a physicist that he made the argument that it's not only, they did a mathematical proof of this, is space and time and matter are not only relative to the observer, but are created by the observer. The observation brings this into reality. Now, someone says, well, wait a minute. How is this possible? You mean before we view something, can we change reality? Can we, I step off a cliff, maybe I don't want to fall. It's not what it's arguing, because, or did you create the universe? How could you create the universe when you weren't even born yet? And that's some of the implications that some New Age thinkers are pushing, that you create your own reality, but that's not what people are arguing. There is a ground of consciousness. That out of this ground of consciousness emerges the material universe. So it's not that we are emergent too. Our consciousness is emergent of this other consciousness. So how does our consciousness fit, our individual consciousness fit into this larger scheme? And that's what we started to talk about last week. And not last week, our last show. Last month, I think it was. So in this grand scheme of things, we're gonna look at a biblical. We looked at the biblical perspective. And we said that God was, not Plato. St. Paul says, in Him we move and have our being. God is the ground of our being. He's not just a being among many beings. He's the ground of our being. And as an observer, the knower. He's the observer, the knower. He brought, according to one of the sayings of Muhammad, which is, I think it's a pretty good summary of it. I was a hidden treasure and I wish to be known. Well, the knower wants to be known. So in order for the knower to be known, there has to be another knower. So this is what so you got a dilemma here. The knower wants to be known. This is a religious question. I don't think you can philosophically or mathematically or scientifically you can answer this question. This is a religious question. Can an absolute knower, the ground of being, you start off before you have a Big Bang, before you have the emergence of time and space, you have the ground of being, the ground of consciousness. You have consciousness itself. And out of this consciousness becomes the principle of emergent reality as we know it. This is information theory would point towards this kind of consciousness gives rise to information. Information is at the heart of your DNA structure. A lot of both at a cosmological and the biological level, we're beginning to realize more and more that reality is based upon information. And information itself, generally speaking, when you see something that conveys information, is a product of intelligence. You got language, you got mathematics, you got computer code. It conveys information as product of intelligence. Now, in I want to talk about a couple examples in the Bible where you have in Genesis, it talks about God said, "Let there be light," and it was light. God said it. In other words, there's this poetic imagery of God speaking and things coming into being. And the Hebrews made the argument that speech has the creative abilities because speech is the communication of intellect, of intelligence, of consciousness. So the before you have a material reality, you have a consciousness, you have which gives way to information, which gives way to emergent principles of time and space come into being. In the Gospel of John, it talks about in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and everything was created according to the Word. Now, that's the same thing. Word in English is translated word, so the spoken word or the word is a communication of. Well, they use that English interpretation because the word is a symbolic representation of intelligent thought. The Greek in Greek, what is rendered in English as word was rendered in Greek as logos. In the beginning was the logos, and logos is the root word of our word logic. So it's even more clear. In the beginning was the logos. And so the understanding of God as an intellectual, the creation is an intellectual activity aimed at purpose. There's a purpose. Intellect serves purpose. Intellect is a way to formulate a plan. The plan is determined by purpose. The purpose itself may be something that the intellect serves purposes. Was it Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher, once said, "The heart has reasons which reason itself cannot understand." Well, in other words, the heart has purpose for which rational thought does not understand. But the rational thought is useful to make choices, and the choices you make help you to pursue purpose. The heart has purpose, which reason itself cannot, which the heart has reasons, which means purpose. The heart has reasons, which reason itself cannot understand. So you have a reality that's driving this expression of intelligence, of rational thought. And that is a sense of purpose. The knower wants to be known. I was a hidden treasure and I wish to be known. So in religious, there's a religious saying that union in the realm of personality differentiates. It unites, but it differentiates. And then, now I'm going to get back in. I talked about Scott Peck's book, The Road Less Traveled, and then I got this title from his book because his book is called The Road Less Traveled. The title of this show tonight is The Road to Freedom, and there's a reason for that because as you transition from emergent principles of matter and energy and plants and animals and eventually the human beings, you are coming about bringing into existence a reality of the emergence of the knower. In other words, if you look at this from the Judeo-Christian biblical viewpoint, the human beings was created in the image of God, and God wanted his to be known. So therefore, the purpose driving this rational experiment, this rational action, was to create a knower so that the knower can be known, another knower. So there has to be, in Scott Peck's The Road Less Traveled, the subtitle was what is it? A New Psychology of Love, Traditional Values, and Discipline, or was it spiritual growth? I'm sorry, Love, Traditional Values, and Spiritual Growth. In one of Scott Peck's chapters in this book he calls love is separateness. Love is union, but it's also separate, because there's got to be love of another. And part of love is helping the other to grow, not absorbing the other. That is pseudo love. And so you have a separation. You have a union, yes, but you have a separation as well. And this is a paradoxical reality that union love brings about union and separation. We're going to go into this, how this is possible. And we're talking about union. There's a Catholic philosopher, John Senior, I think his name was. He talks about this. In the Eastern philosophy, some interpretations of Eastern philosophy, the emergence of the one, the human, the individual with the one absorbs the individual identity into the oneness. And that's because, according to this Catholic philosopher, that's because this one is impersonal. It's an impersonal force. So a union in a realm of impersonal forces creates an absorption. But union in a realm of personality creates a distinction. You have union and distinction. You have the one. This is an ancient dilemma, the one and the many. Union and diversity. E pluribus unum is one of the statements. Out of many, one. You had an American experiment in Order Liberty where our model was e pluribus unum, out of many, one. So you had all these many cultures that come here from different traditions, and it becomes one. Does that mean it merged and becomes like, or is there a union with the diversity preserved? Can you have a unity within diversity? Can your diversity strengthen the union? This isn't really important, because when we talk about immigration, we talk about people from different cultures and stuff coming here, and some people think it's a threat to our culture. We want to remain a strong union, and so that's why some people want to limit immigration, because their culture, they want to preserve our cultural heritage tradition. The question is, can you have more diversity that actually strengthens that union? And I would say that yes, it depends upon the nature of that union. If it's a religious union in the realm of personality and love, then yes. And let's go into that. Now, we talked last time about, we're going through the process in Genesis where God separates day from night, and he had the greater light rule over the day, and that was the sun. The lesser night rule over the night, and that was the moon. And he separated land from water, and he separated the heavens from the earth. There was all this separation going on. And this, you start from this, in the beginning was a void. So maybe you withdrew his presence and created a void. Into this void you start. God said, let there be light. And in some of your Jewish Second Temple tradition, the light symbolizes God's kavod, or God's glory, God's presence, God's immanent presence, immanent within the creation. Let there be light. And a lot of Eastern religious tradition, they deal a lot with this concept as well. So you had this separation of things coming about. And at the end of this, eventually the purpose of separation is bringing them back together with with unity and diversity. So you got this, you're separating heaven from earth, you're separating land from the waters, you're separating night from the day, you're separating the different days from each other. You're making distinctions and which is something that in some Eastern tradition, distinction is an illusion, because you have oneness with all, and if you're going to have union, you can't have diversity. Well, the whole point of the knower wants to be known. He wants to be known by another knower. So he wants to. They want a union within diversity, unity and diversity. So how that at the end of this process of creating these divisions, you have man was created in the image of God. Male and female, he created them. So that was the first Genesis creation account. There's two Genesis creation accounts. And as I mentioned last time, we're going to go into the second one now. The first Genesis account gives you the big picture. God's bringing this creation into being, and he's pouring forth his spirit, his presence, and he's creating these distinctions, and he's separating them purposely so that you're going to have distinction and division and diversity. And you're going to have night and day, and you're going to have land and ocean, and you're going to have heaven and earth, and you have all these distinctions. And at the end of this process, where he's pouring out every step along the way, he looks at it and says, "This is good. This is good." And when he creates human beings, this is very good. So he's rather pleased with himself and what he's created, but it's not finished yet. So you get to human beings. Now they have what is called the second Genesis creation account. And I can't take credit for this. I've read, there's a book by St. John Paul, or Pope, former Pope John Paul. I'm not Catholic, but the Catholics canonize him, so he would consider him. They consider him St. John Paul. No. So whether he's a saint or not, or whatever people think of John Paul, his writings are brilliant. He was a professor of philosophy in his life before he became Pope. The guy's really smart. He came up with a philosophy of personalism where he talked about the dignity of the human person, and he applied his understanding to an interpretation of the Bible. And he came out with a book called. And the book is based upon his speeches, and someone edited it based upon these speeches he gave. It's called Theology of the Body. And his argument is that the first creation account is an objective viewpoint of human creation and the creation of man in God's own image. Big picture view from the 100,000 feet or whatever. Man's role in the universe. The second creation account is a more subjective account. It's more the experience of human beings experiencing that role and how they experience it. And it goes into, and this is my interpretation, this road less traveled that Scott Peck talks about. Is less traveled because people don't. It's a difficult road. It requires a lot of discipline. And so the spiritual growth, he refers to it as a road less traveled because people don't want to take it. It's not easy. I call it the road to freedom because I'm interpreting this as the path is going to bring us union with our creator, but distinction, individual but union with not only a creator, but with the people around us and with the world itself. So you can have unity within diversity, but that's possible. And that is the path to freedom, because transcendence, unity with the transcendent, is what brings about freedom. So how do we have this unity with the transcendent, which brings unity with those around us and preserves our freedom, preserves our identity, and creates a union of diversity? That's what I want to talk about. And my argument is that this second Genesis account, the second creation account in Genesis, it lays out a path. I believe there's a way towards freedom, and then there's a way away from freedom. And we're going to get into that and what is typically been referred to as the human fall or the snake. And we're going to, maybe next time we'll get into that one. But so you have this Garden of Eden motif where God, he brings this creation into being. Then he wants to plant a garden, but he hasn't created the water to flow to irrigate the garden yet, because there was not a man to till the soil yet. So it's pretty clear in here that part of his creation is not complete until he has human beings. And they use the word Adam, and then male and female. They use the same term, Adam, that they use for the creation of man in his own image. And me, if I'm reading this, I don't read Hebrew, but I've talked to people who I've read interpretations as people have read Hebrew, and you have the term man, Adam, which refers to the human of the species, male and female. He created them. So he created man in his own image, male and female. So there was not a man to. He's talking about human beings. It was he's not ignoring woman, but this Adam is not the name of the male of the species, or a particular name. It refers to, in this understanding, it refers to human beings. So you begin with so you got animals. Animals are created collectively as groups. He made great whales, he made fish, and they crawl on the earth, and he made plants for food. So the creation narrative is as is going along. Every step of the way is basically referring to these animals as a group. Then all of a sudden he comes to the creation of man. And this is interesting because before he gets there, he didn't send water for irrigation of this garden because he didn't have a man to irrigate the garden, to tend the soil. So he creates this garden, and he takes up soil, dust from the ground, and he blows into it, and man became a living soul. Now this is there's really interesting thing here. One is that the creation of Adam, man, human beings, was a personal event. It wasn't we created human beings. In this interpretation, he takes up the ground, and man became a living soul. So now he says it is not good for the man to be alone. He's going to bring the animals to him. Now, ruah, breath, he blew ruah, and the Hebrew word is ruah, can be breath or spirit, or the animating force of human life, ruah, God's spirit. So human beings, they have a body from the dust of the ground. They have a spirit. They are a soul. The soul is not an entity that we possess. It is our identity. According to this understanding, we have matter and we have spirit blowing into it. And our sense of identity is man became a living soul. He didn't say man was given a soul. Man became a living soul. So the soul, according to this understanding, is a psychosomatic unity of spirit and matter. Is identity of who we are. So there is a personal, intimate action going on here, which preempts previews what this ultimate union of God and man starts out as an individual thing, intimate, personal communion. And so he notes that it is not, man is alone at first, human beings, and what St. Paul, former Pope John Paul refers to original loneliness. So you got this original loneliness where there's a solitary entity. So it's not good the man be made alone. So because in the rest of the creation, they weren't created alone, they were created in groups. But man was made, he was a solitary. And when I say he, I'm referring to the species. This is more about the human being. Sometimes it is portrayed in a masculine sense because, and I'll get into that in a minute, differentiation as opposed to union is more seen as a masculine trait, whereas union is more seen as a feminine trait. In biology, the basic construct of biological expression is female, according to some. I won't go into the details, dig up all the details of biologists say that. But the human being, the male is made physically from a differentiation of the female pattern. And females, and we'll get into this in a minute, tend, and I'm not referring just biologically, but femininity, I'm not referring to gender now, I'm referring to a characteristic. What is characteristic of femininity is union, communion, union. What is characteristic of masculinity is distinction. And when you have the two together, you have union and distinction. And they each have their own strengths, and that's why it's important that the two, when we're going to get the union of men, but I want to make this distinction that some people, why does the creation of Adam, even though it's meant to be human being, why does it come off as appear to be masculine? And I would make the argument because this part of this process is describing your distinction, because he brought the animals to Adam, and Adam's exploring, and he's naming the animals, and you got scientific exploration, but basically there is a conclusion that he didn't have a helpmate suitable for him. His distinction, man as distinct from the animals, just like man is distinct from woman in biologically, the basic pattern, biological pattern is female, and the male biologically distinguishes itself from that pattern and grows different attributes that or become more distinct in time goes on. But so you get this point where this first part, original distinction, original uniqueness, the unique value, his uniqueness is asserted by coming to the point where he realizes that he did not have a helpmate suitable for him. So, and I want to say something about, in neuroscience, they've talked about exploration, and your exploration of the brain, exploration of your environment helps to shape your brain. So there's another thing too, that God is bringing animals into Adam, and Adam is naming them, and you got that exploration of that's going on, which is helping in his development, brain development. His intellect, his capability is being immersed. And I want to go, before I go into the union of the two, male and female, they became one flesh, I want to talk about this garden motif. God plants a garden, he puts man in it. The garden motif is very similar. I was raised in Judeo-Christian tradition, of religious equivalent being home school, so I'm more familiar with the Garden of Eden. But my wife is Japanese. We've been to Japan before, and the Zen gardens is another. Most of these religious traditions, you have garden. You got in China the Taoists. You got the gardens in China. You Taoists. In these different religious traditions, there's a garden motif, and the tending of the garden is a spiritual exercise. And particularly, I've been to Kyoto, is where they have the Zen headquarters. You get the beautiful Zen gardens are beautiful. But I want to suggest that this garden motif has a spiritual. There's a spiritual statement being made about man's. There's more explicit in the Garden of Eden motif in the Bible. Man was put there to tend to the garden. In many different religious traditions, tending to a garden is a spiritual discipline. If you're tending to a garden, you're not just part of the garden, you're responsible for the garden. So you're bringing out beauty in the garden, you're cultivating beauty, you're tilling the garden. So it's an economic activity, it's an activity, artistic activities, beauty, and it's an activity that helps you to know the creator, because God's presence is known in the things that are created, as it talks about in many different, St. Paul talks about in Romans, the heavens and earth were declare the glory of God. This is there's many different examples in Hebrew texts, but or what we refer to as the Old Testament. The Jews refer to it as just Hebrew scriptures. But this garden motif is very important. So he's cultivating beauty, and this beauty is something that is attractive. And there is a relationship, in Plato when discovered this, a relationship between love and beauty. Love attracts beauty, and beauty accentuates love. And love has the ability to bring union and distinction. Now I want to talk a little bit more about how this happens before I go into this love and beauty distinction in Plato. I want to go back to Scott Peck's Road Less Traveled, and he talks about ego boundaries. And you're talking about the expansion of ego boundaries versus the sudden collapse of the ego boundaries. And there's a difference between these two, even though they're confused with one another sometimes. The expansion of ego boundaries requires effort. Is spiritual growth. It's what Jonathan Edwards, America's most prominent philosopher and theologian, once said, that you have self-expansion versus self-contraction. The self-expansion is the expansion of ego. Your sense of self is expanded. Your ego boundary is your sense of self. So if you're in spiritual growth, you reach out to others in active love, and your spiritual boundaries spread, but your ego boundaries they become wider, broader, but they become more permeable. And as they become more permeable, they meld in, they kind of overlap. So you can incorporate the word in psychology is cathexis. When you love something and you embrace the other, cathexis through love, you incorporate an image of that into your own identity. So I am in you and you are in me. And in the Gospel of John, it says, in that day we will know that I am in you, you in me, and I am in God and you're in God, and we're all, God becomes all in all. This is not a merger of loss of identity like collective. This is a unity in diversity. Your identity, your sense of self is expanded and becomes fluid and permeable. Your boundaries become permeable so they can overlap, and one boundary can incorporate the other, and you can have a union with much of reality and much of the world without losing your identity. As a matter of fact, your sense of identity is strengthened, because your sense of identity is bigger, and it is united with much of the world, with God, but it's become part of you. It's not absorbed. You're not absorbed into something bigger. You become part of something bigger, but that something bigger has become part of you too. And this is a unity and diversity which maintains your identity. Now, this is, I believe, the opposite of that is the sudden collapse of ego boundaries, which can be artificially induced through drugs, through different rituals. Sometimes the sexual activity can cause that, or intense music. So you get an experience, like for instance, and there's my You get a high in drug. Once I both there's Carry On My Wayward Son. Once I rose above the noise and confusion just to get a glimpse beyond this illusion. I was soaring ever higher, but I flew too high. You get this could be interpreted as the experience you get when you get high. I wouldn't know from experience because I haven't taken drugs, but I've read a lot about it. Your sense of self is collapsed, and you kind of mystically feel this sense of being merged with all of reality. But it is not a result of cathexis. It's not a result of your extension of your boundaries. It's the artificial collapse of that boundary. And that the old fertility cults used to have these drugs, maybe liquor made of fruit, some kind of fruit, intoxicating fruit juice. So, frenzied music and sexual activity with with a temple prostitute. It's part of his divination rituals to become one with God. These are what leads to what is referred to as peak experiences. And the argument here is that in and of themselves, they are not necessarily a problem. The peak experience is not a problem in and of itself. It's when you use it as a substitute for the growth. In a lot of religious traditions, having a little bit of alcohol, like a wine and communion, I think can be the reason why that is because it loosens you up and it allows this growth. It can facilitate the growth. But if you use it as a substitute and you use ceremonial rituals or drug abuse or whatever, you use this, then it's destructive, very destructive. And I believe this is the key to the distinction between when God warned Adam and Eve not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And I'm going to get into that maybe in the next our next presentation. I think this is what he's referring to. Don't take the shortcut. Don't because what happens is that you have this drug-induced high, or it doesn't have to be drugs. It can be, I mean, the music industries, you had the sexual revolution in America, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And it was a new consciousness, a new peace. We're going to bring about peace and the war, and we're going to, but it left destruction in its wake. And the ideas were great initially, but it became a substitute for religion. And instead of incorporating it into religion, incorporated it into spiritual growth, it became a substitute for it. And life expectancy of a lot of these performers became very low, and they died early. And there's a part of this lyric to a song: "The more you live, the faster you will die." Well, that's not true. It's only true if you're not living properly. It's not necessarily true that just because you live properly, you're going to be born and dead. The more you live, in order to really live, you're going to die faster because you got to live on the edge to experience these kind of oneness with reality. No, you don't. That's the problem. And I want to the sense of ego boundaries, if they're not grown and they're artificially dropped all at once because of this peak experience, and you don't use spiritual growth to expand them, if you don't use sexuality and some of these tools that weaken your ego boundaries in order to expand them, then they're going to come back more rigid than before. And it's going to take a more intense experience next time to cause the same thing. And eventually you're going to be addicted to it because you want this experience as high, and it's harder and harder to get each time. And so your life goes in a downward spiral. We're going to get into that. Now I want to talk about the Greeks refer to as eros, this erotic love, which is attracted to beauty. And beauty attracts love, and love accentuates beauty. Plato had what he referred to as a ladder of love. You start off by love, appreciation of a beautiful body, and maybe this person is going to be, and it attracts you to that person. But then you see someone else, they got a beautiful body, and then doesn't necessarily mean you should take up a relationship with him, but you recognize that there is beauty itself is not contained within one person. It is a universal concept. So you become in love with the concept of beauty. And you got to be careful about that, because it could be interpreted as promiscuousness, and that's not what Platonic love is all about. So then you have the love of justice, the law. You see the law, hopefully, in patriotic society, the law of the society you live in brings about justice. So patriotism is love of justice, love of one's country, because of the law, supposedly the just. But then you that patriotism is, you see the justice of the laws of your country, and then you see, well, there are justice in the laws of other countries as well. And so you become in love with the concept of justice itself, and not just a particular example of that. So you become in love with the concept of justice. Then you have truth, and you have these academic disciplines, and you love science, you love math, but then that becomes a love of truth itself. Eventually, the highest love is, you see the beauty of this. There's the beauty of physical body. There's the beauty of justice. There's the beauty of truth, and that beauty attracts love. And there's love of truth, love of goodness, love of beauty, love. And then eventually you come, in Plato, the highest form, this transcendent form, is called the good. And you love of the good. In the love of the good, you become united with the good, and that's the ultimate destination. In the Christian tradition, they took Plato's ladder of love and referred to it as ladder of divine ascent. And this is where the divine ascent became union with God. The union with God is preserved through our growth of the sense of self, as I explained. And so you have a union with God that preserves your personality. And now, as this union, go back to Plato's the union of bodies, beautiful body. I wanted to make this distinction about promiscuousness, because in the biblical model, you got man and woman, and you male and female, Adam and Eve, and Eve became the mother of all. And then they said the two became one flesh. They have this poetic imagery of Eve taking, Adam being going to sleep, and then God taking a rib out of Adam and sewing it up, and out of that became Eve. And Adam wakes up and he's, wow, this is flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone. So for this reason, the man will leave his family, his mother and father, and cleave to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So this is a poetic way of describing the union of husband and wife, the union of man and woman, male and female. The reason why we seek completion in religion is because we're incomplete. As Augustine wrote a lot about this. There is a yearning gap for completion, for transcendence. But part of that completion, the ultimate completion, is the union with the transcendent. there's something about human beings. Why does a mountain climber climb the mountain? Because it's there. It's something to conquer, something to overcome. There's an incompleteness. We need challenges to overcome. We need growth. And that's a little bit, if there's not food at the top of it, the animals aren't going to try and climb the mountain. That's a little bit different. The human beings feel this incompleteness because we want to transcend our limits. And part of that we have a human personality is male and female. And the two become one flesh. We are incomplete and we complete one another. Humans are completed by God, but also completed by each other. And the basis of human society is the vertical, the transcendence of the human individual relationship with God, but then there's the relationship between humans themselves, and where that axis comes together is the relationship between man and woman in the sight of God. This is not just in Oriental philosophy, you refer to it as yin and yang. You had the Tao, only in this case, you have God. And out of this oneness, you have polarity. And polarity is complementary, and they're not complete without the other. You have plus and minus. You have atoms, and you have electrons, and you have protons, and you have plus charges, minus charges. The opposites attract, and they form a higher reality. And out of this higher reality, you have children, you have community, so this is a pattern. So you have this individual identity in the first part where God creates Adam and creates man, blows them into, they form this reality, and man becomes a living soul, and he finds his own dignity and destiny in this naming of the animals. He finds out that he is unique and he doesn't have a helpmate suitable for him. And then you have the communion of Adam and Eve, where they flesh of my flesh and bone of my, the two become one flesh. They are incomplete without each other, like the yin and the yang of the Taoism, except in this, you've got the two become one flesh. Out of this reality becomes human life is brought into being, and you have community. So you, from this love, the eros, the shaping of society, the eros, the love and beauty, the beauty of the husband and wife completing each other, the noble beauty of the husband and the sensual beauty of the wife attract one another, and then they attract each other's love, and that love accentuates that beauty, and that love make the two become one flesh. And this two becoming one flesh preserves their identity, because it is not it is a union of love and personality. So therefore their identities are strengthened and expanded. Like this union with God, the union with one another is strengthened and expanded, and out of this a human society comes into being. The love of truth, the love of goodness, the love of justice, the love of human civilization is brought into being through love and beauty. Technology comes about through the love of truth. You're taking care of the creation. You're taking care of the creation. You're taking care of your neighbors. You're taking care of your family. So you want to care for them. You have economic activity, garden. Economic activity. It brings about economic activity. It brings about religious activity. It brings about the creation of arts and stuff like that, beauty. And so Adam and Eve were naked and unashamed. Naked refers to sensuality and sexuality. Sensuality and sexuality are holy and part of the original plan, as long as it doesn't go astray. And we're going to get into that next time. They're looking for, the ultimate goal is to partake of the tree tree of life. That historically has been looked upon as a symbol of eternal life. Now, there's some scientists have said that they can't find a reason for degeneration. So you have generation, you have degeneration. Is it possible that human degeneration can be overcome? Some religious people would say yes, and that was the way it was meant to be, but the failure to achieve the tree of life, we didn't get there. So next time we're going to talk about why we didn't get there, but we were on the way there, and that's what I think this the Genesis story is an archetypical story. It talks about the path of freedom, that we're on this path towards complete generation, unity and diversity, and love and beauty. And we somehow got off the track. And so we're going to talk next time about how we got off that track, which understanding how we got off track will help us to get back on track. So we'll see you next time, and we'll be able